What's up? I'm AJ and welcome back to Gen Z Garage. In the last video, we assembled the engine and the transmission and we installed them onto the subframe. In today's episode, we're going to be installing the intake manifold and the exhaust manifold, as well as various other parts. Make sure you stay to the end though, because I have a really amazing surprise for you guys.
For anyone who's ever owned other transversely mounted Iron Duke vehicles, you probably consider the motor difficult to work on. On these GM vehicles, the intake manifold faces the firewall of the car, with the exhaust manifold at the front behind the radiator. With nearly everything on the intake side, routine maintenance and tuning becomes wildly inconvenient since access to almost any part you actually want to get at is located at the back of the engine. That's because the Iron Duke was originally designed to be used almost exclusively in a longitudinally mounted configuration for cars such as the Pontiac Sunbird, Osprey, and Oldsmobile Omega. In the Fiero, however, this frustration is completely reversed as the exhaust manifold faces the front of the car with the intake side accessible from the rear. In this image of the motor we just rebuilt, the distributor, oil pressure sending unit, intake manifold, EGR, oil pump drive, and many other components all become easily accessible with the deck lid open. Even still, the best time to get everything bolted back onto the motor is when the motor is out of the car. I start the assembly with the intake manifold. I use a Felpro gasket meant specifically for our cross-flow heads. The Felpro is one of the only gaskets that comes with the fail-safe groove to prevent leaks from the coolant passage from working their way into the intake ports. With the water port properly coated with compression RTV sealant, I loosely install the intake manifold using only the two bottommost bolts first. If you have an 84 to 86, you might notice these bolts look different. I have a spare 1988 motor that I'm using several parts from, and the hardware was much improved on the 88, so I use the 88's hardware whenever possible. With the two lower manifold bolts loosely installed, the Felpro gasket has the two lower holes notched, which allows me to simply drop the gasket in place. I then begin installing the remaining bolts and remove the lower left bolt, as this is where the engine loop bracket will install. If you're curious why the manifold looks so new, I pressure washed it, soaked it in degreaser, and painted it with new look aluminum high temp ceramic paint. I also removed the water plugs, cleaned out the threads, painted them the factory color, and reinstalled them. Next, I install the engine loop bracket on the left side with the appropriate hardware, and then torque down all of the bolts to 29 foot-pounds. With all of the intake bolts torqued down, I begin installing the EGR valve. I first spray the new EGR gasket with copper gasket spray on both sides, and then carefully place it down on top of the intake EGR mating surface. I then take the reconditioned EGR valve and begin tightening down the 10mm bolts on either side. Next, I install the reconditioned thermostat housing and water neck on the rear of the cylinder head. These are both 13mm bolts. I then install my brand new 195-degree thermostat and install the new thermostat cap. I now go to the other side of the intake and begin installing one of the first engine brackets, which also supports the intake. This bracket serves as both the alternator adjustment bracket and also where the engine upper strut mount connects to the frame. Next, we move over to the right side of the motor and I begin installing the water pump and water pump housing. Don't forget to use thread sealer on several of the water pump housing bolts. Otherwise, you'll be doing this job all over again when the motor is already in the car. Next, I begin installing the front AC bracket, which attaches to both the front and the side of the motor. You may also again notice that these brackets look different. That's because I'm using some of the brackets from the 1988 motor, including test fitting the belt deflector and cable support bracket that attaches to the water pump. I'll explain more about this later in the video. I remove the top bracket and move to the side and install my brand new oil dipstick and dipstick tube. I coat the bottom with RTV sealant and it slides right into place. It then attaches using a single bolt to the side of the block. With this installed, I then install the new exhaust manifold and heat shield, starting with the top bolt to get it centered. The manifold, heat shield, and dipstick tube are all part of a brand new GM recall kit that is often still available new on eBay. These replace a lot of the older parts and can help freshen up your engine bay. It's compatible with all 5 years of the Iron Duke and will upgrade the 84 to 86 with a newer Thermac heat stove. With the top bolt in, I then loosely install the lower 4 bolts on the manifold. Like the intake gasket, the exhaust manifold gasket has cutouts on the lower bolt holes so that the gasket can be easily dropped into place. Like the EGR gasket, I sprayed both sides of the exhaust manifold gasket with copper gasket spray for better sealing. With the gasket correctly placed, I reinstall the top bolt. For the exhaust manifold, I use a new set of exhaust manifold bolts from the Fiero store. These bolts exceed the OEM specification bolts, but more importantly, they're brand new and not rusty. I loosely reinstall the other top bolts along with an exhaust manifold cage bracket. This bracket gets bolted into place by 2 of the exhaust manifold bolts on the front and rear exhaust ports, with little tabs that get pushed up around the sides of the bolt head. This prevents the bolts from backing out during hot and cold cycles. With the brackets installed and before pushing down the tabs, I torque all of the exhaust manifold bolts down as specified in the shop manual. I take a break from the exhaust manifold and close up one of the holes in the top of my newly painted engine. I start with the PCV valve, which I coat with a little bit of engine lube for ease of installation. In Florida, we have a lot of different lizards, big and small, and they like to hide in places and lay eggs, so it's important to close up engine ports as soon as possible. Next, I install the breather element, which goes in the other hole at the top of the valve cover. With that installed, I move back the exhaust manifold and begin pushing down the little tabs on the manifold bolts. I do this with a large flat head and also a pair of pliers. It doesn't need to be perfect, just enough to keep the bolts tight. As I mentioned earlier, you may have noticed that this manifold has heat shielding on it with the vent off to one side. This is for the Thermac system, which I will explain in much detail in another video. I'm upgrading to the 1987 to 1988 manifold, which eliminates the heat stove from the header pipe, where it's located in the 84 to 86 model years and often rusts away. With the bolts tabbed down, I move back over to the other side to install my freshly painted and cleaned ignition coil in the factory location.
Congratulations! You've made it to the end of the video. Thank you for watching, and now it's time for me to show you the surprise I told you about in the beginning. I want you in the comments below to tell me what you think is different about what I just installed. In the next video, I'm going to be installing all of the other accessories to the engine. So if you want to see that, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Thank you for watching.
Create a car to conquer the wind. A car that lets you slip off the commonplace and experience driving excitement as never before. The Pontiac Firebird Trans Am. Sit here and learn firsthand how Firebird conquers the wind and the world. Pontiac, we build